Today we're talking about the best flood insurance coverage for you. We're going to be talking about better, best, the good, the bad, the ugly. So by the end of this video, you're going to know exactly what's best for you, your peace of mind, satisfying your bank's requirements, and keeping as much money in your pocket as possible. So let's get started. But before we do, remember, make sure to share, subscribe, and like the channel so other people can find this same content that you have found. Hi. I'm Chris, the flood insurance guru. More than 12 years ago, I bought a house in a flood zone and faced terrible challenges. I had trouble figuring out what the best flood insurance coverage was. It ended up I didn't have the best flood insurance coverage. So that's why I'm shooting this video here today, is to help you avoid the mistake I made more than 12 years ago. So today, we're talking about the best flood insurance coverage. We're going to talk about flood insurance options. We're going to talk about flood insurance coverages. We're even going to talk about deductibles. So as we get started though, we've also got to talk about flood zones. So that needs to be our first conversation, is what's the better flood zone to be in? When we're talking about coverages and options and all this, first of all, when we're talking about flood zones, we're talking about two things here. We're talking about special flood hazard areas, non-special. What's the difference here? Now in the corner of this video, you can also dive deeper into our playlist on flood zones, but let's briefly talk about this. If you're in a non-special flood hazard area, typically this is where a bank's not requiring flood insurance, or flood zone X. Sometimes the federal government calls these lower risk or minimum risk, but don't let that catch you off guard, because still about 30% of flooding happens in these areas. But just remember, if you're in a non-special area or flood zone X, typically that's not where a bank's going to require flood insurance. However, if you're in a special flood hazard area, also called a 100-year flood zone, you may be in something like flood zone A or flood zone V, like if you're on the coast. These are areas where banks are going to require flood insurance. Now, there are some areas like flood zone C and B, typically where flood insurance is not required. But really what you want to pay attention to here is special versus non-special and understanding the difference there. Now, what's the better flood zone to be in, or what's the best flood zone to be in? That's up to you. But remember, flood zones actually have very little to do with flood risk now. They're really just set there from a regulatory standpoint. So if we're talking about strictly from having a mortgage, of course, flood zone X is going to be the better flood zone to be in there. But as I said, don't let that surprise you though when you have a flood, because these are really just used from a regulatory standpoint. Now let's talk about flood insurance options. And we're going to talk a little about, hey, what's the better flood insurance option in these different zones? So when we're talking about flood insurance options, so we're talking about the National Flood Insurance Program. Let's talk briefly about that first. And what we're talking about here is the National Flood Insurance Program. Remember, this is the government program. So no matter where you go, rates should be the same, unless you're changing out coverages, deductibles, and things like that. And we'll talk about that a little bit in just a second. Now, the only big difference here is when it comes to what's the better flood insurance? Setting up a new policy with the federal government, or maybe taking over someone else's policy, maybe they already had flood insurance in a house like this. I know, because I did this. It was called a policy assumption, and I actually did it on my own property more than 12 years ago. And it was definitely the better option at the time. You see, the buyer was going to get about a $3,000 rate. The rate I had was $350. So we simply transferred that policy to them, where their rate gradually went up over time, but they didn't get hit with all that premium at one time. So when we're talking about the National Flood Insurance Program, first thing you want to look at is a policy assumption available. And that's really easy to know. You can click in the description of this video and reach out to us, and we can typically tell you within about 5 to 10 minutes whether you have this available or not, and what some of the benefits to you would be on there. You can also download our guide to policy assumptions in the description of this video as well. Now, when we talk about the National Flood Insurance Program, now let's talk about coverages here. Remember, the National Flood Insurance Program offers building coverage up to $250,000 on your actual building. So remember, we're talking about actual building coverage. We're talking about like things right here behind me that are physically attached to the building, like this island right here. We're talking about contents coverage. We're talking about things like here on the counter that you can see right here behind me. We're not talking about things like the dishwasher or refrigerators on that first floor. Those technically could fall under building coverage. Now, if it's a basement, freezers and refrigerators would typically fall under contents coverage. So that's how coverages work when it comes to the amount of coverage. Remember, the National Flood Insurance Program, as we mentioned, on residential properties, these are typically properties of 40 units or less, or a single family home up to $250,000. And then you've got contents coverage up to $100,000. But also remember, if this is not a primary residence for you, the National Flood Insurance Program is charging you a surcharge, $225 on top of what you already have. So if you see that surcharge on there called the Home Insurance Affordability Act surcharge, that's what that is. So that's the National Flood Insurance Program. Now, let's get us a little bit into coverages with the National Flood Insurance Program. We talked about the amount of coverage available and all these things. Now let's talk about replacement costs versus actual cash value. Now it's important to understand that with the National Flood Insurance Program, they have some conditions to make sure that you can get coverages up to $250,000. Their condition is that you've got to insure this property for 80% of the replacement cost. That's the actual cost to rebuild, or the max coverage available. And I'll tell you a story about a customer from Texas that came to us many years ago. Had like 4 flood claims. And each one of the flood claims only paid about $15,000, $20,000. She couldn't figure it out. Her policy was for $100,000. And the reason why the payout was so low was because she was not insuring for 80% of the replacement cost. So these were defaulting to an actual cash value, which had significant depreciation taking off the claim, as well as other things. Come claims time, this was a pretty disappointing thing for her. Now, thankfully, she's got a policy in place that's got that 80% on there, so she doesn't have to worry about that anymore. But you've got to understand that when it comes to the National Flood Insurance Program here, hey, what do I need to know to get the best coverage through the National Flood Insurance Program? And it's that 80% rule. We see people every day come claim time that are really disappointed because they didn't have this in place. Now let's talk about contents. What about replacement costs on contents? As I shoot this video here in 2024, currently the National Flood Insurance Program does not offer replacement cost on contents, only actual cash value. So you want to remember that when you're insuring your contents. You also want to remember, typically contents is very limited in basements with the National Flood Insurance Program. It's typically only covering things that make the building safe. It might cover a fridge, freezer, things like that. That's it. It's not covering your couch. It's not covering your big screen TV. So when you go to finish out that basement and you've got flood insurance coverage with the National Flood Insurance Program, you want to remember that. Now, we've spent some time talking about the National Flood Insurance Program. What about deductibles with the National Flood Insurance Program? Deductibles can range from $1,250 to $10,000 on most flood insurance policies with the National Flood Insurance Program. Here's a little secret that most people don't realize, because on all these other insurance, hey, if I shoot my deductible up, it's going to save me a ton of money. Typically, with flood insurance, what we see is you may take on a deductible from $5,000 to $1,250 instead, and guess what? Your deductible just went up almost $4,000, so about $3,500 probably. You just saved about $25 a year. So you really want to pay attention to that when picking deductibles. If you think you're in a high risk area or come claim time, hey, how long is it going to take me to get this higher deductible back from a savings of $50? I mean, look, that could take you 100 years almost to make that up. So you want to think about that. But what you also want to think about, hey, when you pick that higher deductible, remember, the building coverage is going to have a deductible and contents is going to have a deductible. So that's the National Flood Insurance Program, how it works with replacement costs, actual cash value. What's better, or what's the best solution here with the National Flood Insurance Program? Now let's talk a little bit about private flood insurance, which can be a game changer, but it's not always your best option. So let's get into that. So now we're talking about private flood insurance. Remember, private flood insurance is different from the federal government by it's through private companies. And it's usually through a collection of reinsurance companies like a Lloyd's of London or somebody like that comes together to help build an insurance product. Now with private flood insurance, things can be a little tricky as well. Typically a lot of them have a rule that a property has to be insured for a certain amount. Like we talked about in the National Flood Insurance Program, that 80% rule. A lot of these private companies want to see 80 to 90% of replacement costs in order to get the coverage amount that's on that policy. If not, it could default to an actual cash value policy. So it's important to remember that when you're selecting your coverages, and you want to make sure that you get the best flood insurance here, and not necessarily, hey, I'm just getting the amount my bank is telling me to get. And we'll get into the bank coverages in just a few minutes. But you want to remember that we're private. Also remember we talked about the National Flood Insurance Program, how pricing typically is the same no matter where you go. Well, that's not the case with private. In fact, many days at the Flood Insurance Guru, we might see one carrier that's $400. We might see another one that's $4,000. This is why looking at different options as a homeowner, as a real estate investor, is so important on private flood insurance. Not just today, 36 months from now. What does that runway look like? How have the claims been? How have the renewal rate increases been? These are questions you want to ask your insurance agent as you're interviewing them when selecting your flood insurance. Now, with private flood insurance, we talked about that $250 limit with the National Flood Insurance Program. Private flood insurance in some situations can go up to $4 million. It depends on the company. So you can definitely get a lot more coverage with private. On contents coverage, you can typically also get more than $100,000, and you can also get replacement costs on contents. You can even get some coverage for contents in a basement, typically up to about $10,000 or $20,000, depending on the company. Now that could be huge when we're talking about coverages for homeowners. Not so much probably real estate investors, because they typically don't have that many contents in the property anyway. Now, with another coverage that the National Flood Insurance Program does not offer that private does is something called temporary living expense, loss of use. So let's talk about from a homeowner standpoint first. From a homeowner standpoint, imagine your house like this right here floods, and you need a temporary place to live, and it's going to take 6 months for your house to be prepared. That's 6 months of living expenses, man. That's a lot of money. Let's just say, to make it easy, your mortgage is $1,000, and you need a place to live at $1,000 a month for 6 months. Right there, man, that's $6,000. That's not even talking about utility bills and all this stuff. This is where additional living expense can come into play as you as a homeowner. You see, we had a customer in Nebraska that experienced this in 2018. She was the only one on her block that had additional living expenses. And she ended up having a hotel paid for 6 months when her neighbors had nothing. This took a huge financial strain off of her emotionally. The recovery was much quicker for her than it was her neighbors because of the coverage she had here. So it's important to understand that. Now let's look at it from a real estate investor standpoint. Imagine your real estate property floods and your tenant's got to move out, but they can't pay rent. Where are you going to get that? This is where loss of use or loss of income on your flood insurance policy kicks in. This is exactly what we had happen with a real estate investor in the St. Louis area. They experienced 12 inches of rain in 4 hours. Tenants had to move out. The city said it was unlivable for almost a year. So they didn't get any rent for almost a year. Imagine not getting rent on an apartment building for a year compared to a house. As you can imagine, much higher exposure there. But do you have the money there to cover that loss of rent for almost a year just sitting on that property while you're doing repairs and all these things? This is where loss of income can protect you as a real estate investor. Remember, these coverages as we shoot this video in 2024 are not offered through the National Flood Insurance Program. Now let's talk a little bit about deductibles with private flood insurance. Now, just like we talked about with the National Flood Insurance Program, you've got many deductibles. Now, the cool thing is that with a lot of private companies, you do have deductibles at $1,000, which can be very beneficial. But remember, just like with the National Flood Insurance Program, you're not saving much money by picking a higher deductible. So the better option here might actually be to pick a lower deductible, not a higher deductible. Because remember, you're going to have a deductible for building coverage, contents coverage, and that additional living expense. So it could be 3 different deductibles. So it comes claims time. If you decide to pick a $5,000 deductible, you may have a $15,000 deductible. Just remember that. So we talked about National Flood Insurance Program. We've talked about a private flood insurance. So what's the best option for flood insurance? Well, when it comes to understanding better and best options here, look, the better option is simply having flood insurance coverage in place. The best option though, is you've got to understand your flood risk score. And you can find that in the bottom of this video here, understanding the risk, what is the overall risk of your property flooding over a 30-year period. When you understand that, and you understand that, hey, maybe private flood insurance is very volatile in my market, like an area that we're seeing in Myrtle Beach right now because of all the hurricanes that have hit. Maybe the National Flood Insurance Program is a better option for me because of the rate increases that are much lower because they're typically capped at 18%. These are all things you need to look at. You also need to look at, am I truly going to be able to get the replacement cost off my property on whatever policy I select? That's another important factor. The other next factor is, let's talk about bank requirements. Only taking out coverage for what your bank is requiring. What's the best option here? We hear from people that, hey, I only want to insure for what my bank's requiring. Let's say your bank's only requiring $100,000 in coverage on a property that has a replacement cost of $200,000. Let's say you just only decide to do the amount of the coverage for the bank, which is what we hear from people every day. Once you take out the actual cash value of that policy, it may be worth half what your bank's requiring. If a flood loss happens, it's a total loss. You may only get half of what your loan amount is. This means you may end up having to take out a small business disaster loan to cover the difference over the next 30 years. We've seen this happen to homeowners that are paying on an SBA loan on a house they no longer even live in. So this is something to think about when figuring out what the best coverage is when selecting whether you should take what your bank's requiring or what the recommended coverages are there. So we've talked about flood insurance options. We've talked about flood insurance coverages. We've talked about deductibles. We've even talked about, dealing with the banks. Look, at the end of the day, you want to make sure you have the best flood insurance coverage in place because come claims time, it's not the time to learn that. And that's why as a homeowner, as a real estate investor, you want to do your homework. And that's why we've built a guide to flood insurance in the description of this video for you to help you through this process, to help you understand what questions to ask. Because when I was in your situation more than 12 years ago, I struggled because I didn't know what questions to ask. And it put me in a bad spot where my premiums were going to be $3,000 instead of $300. These are all things you want to make sure that you have the answers to as you're out there and you're searching. If you're ready to take that next step of getting a flood insurance quote or maybe even setting up a flood insurance policy, it's easy. You can click in the description of this video, go to our website, and it's 3 simple steps to getting a quote. And within 24 business hours, we're gonna have all the different options in your hands. We're gonna help you understand your flood risk score, your replacement cost. We're gonna help you understand what's happening in the market long term. Because at the end of the day, it's our job to help protect you, not just today, but in the future as well. And it's our job to help equip you with the education you need to do that. I'm Chris, the Flood Insurance Guru. I want to say thank you for watching today's video. Before you jump off, make sure to share, subscribe, and like the channel so others can find the same value in the content in this video. I look forward to speaking with you in our next video. Thank you.